I think we have to be very careful here because, we can make the Bertrand Russell argument very quickly against them that believing nonsense because it seems to make you happier or have some pragmatic or utilitarian purpose is not a reasonable thing to do. Because if it's not true, it'll end up actually fucking reality up in some ways as you're operating on a not true map of the real territory, but affecting the territory in the process. So I don't think it's that we want to indulge things that are untrue because it seems comforting. I think it's that we recognize that the philosophy of science and utilitarianism do not give us access to all of the true. And so then we have to say, what is an expanded epistemology for the domain of the real, not just the domain of the repeatable and the objective? So in the same way that, and then people very quickly say, well, intuition is just pretty obviously corrupted by desires and fears and blah, blah. Rationality is obviously corrupted. You actually have to train rationality. This is actually what formal logic and mathematics and critical thinking and, all of the domains of learning how to fucking think properly are, because we've all heard people make rational arguments that are just utterly gibberish because of lots of rational mistakes, logical fallacies, whatever. You have to train intuition as well. And if you look at what narcissists and sociopaths will do in gaslighting that will end up fucking other people up, gaslighting is usually making a rational argument that someone feels compelled to believe that gets them to override their intuition. And so someone's like, man, something fucking feels wrong with this person. Feels like they're not being honest with me or whatever. And then the person makes the argument well enough and they're like, okay, well, I want to give the benefit of the doubt. I don't want whatever it is. And then they realize that they were actually being played by someone that was better at playing the game than they were. There is a way that we can use a rationalist orientation to gaslight ourselves, to override other valid methods of knowing because we don't know how to do the derivation. And we want to be able to do the derivation. We want intellectual congruency. Now, the argument I'm making can then easily be weaponized to smuggle in gibberish. But then recognizing that someone can smuggle in gibberish can also have them reject the truth to the argument. And so there is no way forward other than a truly earnest one, because you can weaponize the arguments on either sides.
I want to return back to or delve into transitionary systems. And some of my these are all related, but some of my questions there are, how do we internalize externalities? What does it look like to eliminate trade-offs? How do we, what technology can help us build, real-time balance sheet of the commons? Are there examples of gain B sort of institutional, examples that exist today, or even directions that you're directionally gain B?
Okay. I was talking about weaponization a moment ago and also virtue signaling earlier. There's a lot of stuff that calls itself conscious capitalism or impact investment or sustainable business or whatever that, is basically advertising something gain B like that is never going to violate a fiduciary responsibility to do profit maximization or actually have any real consequentiality on its own advantage. And it's just basically taking a part of its marketing or talent retention budget to, appeal to millennials or to regulatory bodies or whatever it is. So are there things that companies can do? Are there things within market dynamics that would be good for the world? Totally. But are there a lot of things that are advertising that they are that aren't actually that? Also totally. So the discernment of anyone who's thinking about getting involved either as an investor or an employee or a whatever, like there has to be fairly close, thoughtful discernment. I was just talking to a guy the other day who had been at one of the top position at one of the major banks and is now in one of the South American countries that has part of the Amazon and is working on a approach to protect the Amazon and use market-based solutions to make the Amazon worth more alive than dead so that, market dynamics will keep it alive. And while that would be a nice thing to do, the particular strategy was like terrible everywhere because, it involved things like, well, the indigenous people who depend upon the environment there and protect it, if we can support their rights in some way, that'll end up supporting the Amazon. Therefore, we're making this fair trade, artisan craft business thing that the indigenous people will produce their stuff and will sell the shit out of it and be able to provide, economic benefit to those acres associated. I'm like, okay, so right now the indigenous people do like 1,000 things, and making just the amount of craft that they need to live is one of the things that they do. Now, as soon as you start providing economic advantage and survival to doing that one thing and not all the other things, and you just convert the indigenous people to a Chinese sweatshop where now everyone just does the artisan craft all of the time, and they try and bring in more people to do that thing. And like, if you want to know how to destroy an indigenous culture, figure out how to monetize one part of it heavily, independent of any kind of value on the other things. And this is where we talked about values that are extractable and exchangeable compared to things that are valuable but aren't extractable and exchangeable. So it's very important to really think through those strategies and say, is this going to be the right way to do it? And when you start to monetize one of the parts that is extractable and exchangeable and not all the other ones, and you confer a lot of advantage in doing that, then obviously you start to bias the entire culture towards doing that particular thing, and you start to lose key other parts. So it's not just that someone has to say, will this be net positive? And in a false dichotomy that says, well, if we don't do that, they're all burned and slaughtered. But you have to say, are there better strategies? So this is actually an important topic. The rationalist community has this, ongoing debate in certain areas on mistake theory versus conflict theory. Michael Vassar turned me on to this thinking. And there's this question of, do we do the dumb things because of mistake theory, meaning there was just no way we could have predicted that externality? It was just too hard. Or conflict theory, which was we didn't really try to predict the externality or the problem, or we even wanted to cause it. And while both are true, one of the things that we have to factor is that mistake theory ends up being a source of plausible deniability for conflict theory. So there are heaps of places where we are actually doing something that we know is going to cause harm. And whether it's P&G not fixing their things, or the deep shore thing, not fixing its oil rigging, or the whatever, like, we know something's going to cause a problem. Or we don't know it is, but we didn't really try to do good safety analysis either, because that would have been expensive. And then after the fact, we say there's no way we could have known. So we'll end up using complexity and mistake theory as a source of plausible deniability for being assholes. And so we have to be very careful not to do that. So oftentimes we'll look at a strategy and make a very false comparison and say, well, either we do this or don't do this. And if we don't do it, great tragedy. So we straw man all the other possibilities to then support why ours is utilitarian the best, as opposed to really try to think, are there better strategies? And probably there are much better strategies, but maybe they take more thinking and don't provide as much immediate capitalization for me. So again, there is no answer other than really deep earnestness of what you actually care about. Okay, so the reason I brought that up is to say, are there things that are advertised as transitional or gamey or vectoring in the right direction that really should not be considered that? Yes. So one has to really do the thoughtful sense making if they actually care about the direction things are really oriented. Attention economy. What could be done there? I haven't done a thorough enough analysis to be able to make full suggestions and say that when we run all of the, try and as best we can, second, third order effects, that this would be the right thing to do, but we can at least propose in the direction of. I think Jaron Lanier's argument around that one of the problems of the Facebook, YouTube kind of attention capture world, one of the sources of the kind of Tristan Harris problems, is that the internet was developing in a way where we both wanted information to be free and we wanted entrepreneurs to be able to make a lot of money. And so the answer was the advertising model. And the advertising model fucks up the fiduciary relationship orientation, where Facebook, the user is not the customer, the advertiser is the customer. So their actual orientation is to optimize the utility for their customer, and that's their fiduciary responsibility. But the person that is using it, that is sharing all of their personal information and their life and the degree of personal information they share with everybody over Messenger and whatever, is then all being weaponized against them for, the advertiser. Whereas if there was a pay for service model, it would be closer to a market. Like in terms of the Adam Smith theory, make a product or service and deliver it to a customer at a value that they want to pay for and deliver a better product to them. As soon as you're intermediating it through deliver it to somebody else's customer where it's not clear, how the market dynamics work, I think you've actually broken what should be the intelligence of the market, and you've made something that's fundamentally has to be evil. And so if people had to pay a monthly fee to access YouTube or to access Facebook, and there was no incentive for them to maximize time on site, there was only an incentive for them to actually have the customers feel more fulfilled with their experience. So rather than drive addiction through hypernormal stimuli, they were trying to drive the actual quality of engagement. I think that would make a huge difference. Now, exactly how do we do that? How do we transition the existing ones? How do we make the new ones? I don't know. A lot of we would have to do deep kind of design work. And to do the design work, we'd have to identify the problem space well enough to do the design work. But just an example of kind of thinking through changes that could be made that still allow businesses to operate, but that don't allow all of the business models, because some of the business models are really fucked enough they should just be regulated against. If you had asked me in a message earlier, what do I think the role of VCs could be? I want to see financial institutions that are created that invest only in technologies that are needed to solve the fundamental problems of the world, including the R&D that's needed in the domain of atoms and energy, not just bits, long-term and large scale. I think that money on money dynamics. So I've got money, I'm going to loan it to you. I want to 10x my money because a bunch of them are going to fail, or 100x or 1000x. So I want the fastest path to liquidity events. I think that is one of the things that has most fucked the entire intelligence of the market. I think that when you look at a kind of classical market, financial services were and should be less than 5% of the total market. And now they're 35, 40%. I think that is completely predative and extractive and not creative. And so, you look at 1971, Nixon getting us off the gold standard and off of the Bretton Woods Convention and the beginning of all of the financial deregulation that occurred. And you see that the government and the market stopped innovating in the way that they had before. We stopped having shit like Apollo projects and Manhattan projects. We started having stupidly bloated F-35s that cost $1.5 trillion that we didn't need in the first place. And so I think that China right now, because, and you can see why, China has an emperor that doesn't have term limits and that basically got rid of the multipolar traps and created a, kind of top-down control system so they can actually coordinate. Well, there's all the fucked up things of dictatorship, but there's also, a democracy or a republic is only better than a dictatorship if you have a really educated population that can overcome the asymmetry of supply side orientation, which we don't have, in which case this thing ends up having so many coordination failures and broken sense making that really you have the simulation of a democracy that is an oligarchy controlling representatives on both sides, so you can't even have accountability to who the fuck the dictator is. And the short-term term limits where nobody will invest in long-term stuff. So China's getting to build high-speed rail all over the fucking country, right? And not just their country, all over Africa and all over, other parts of Southeast Asia and into Europe, and getting to do fundamental R&D and infrastructure development. We haven't done good new infrastructure in forever. Or the kind of R&D. So where the fuck is the thorium research, right? The government should have it's also important to understand when you look at post-World War II, a lot of the things that we attribute to market were actually because of government spending, and the market wouldn't have done it otherwise. A lot of the early contracts to HP and IBM were government contracts that put the money in to be able to do deep R&D that created stuff that then the private sector benefited for. So government's actually investing a percentage of federal budget in R&D and then in infrastructure is important. And so neither is the public sector, is the government doing that, nor does the private sector have 25-year return horizons to be able to do stuff like thorium and trains and whatever. So short-term money on money basically broke everything, right? In the financial sector, short-term money on money, both the directors and officers of a corporation being held on quarterly timelines. So of course they're not going to do something that will give payoff a long time in the future. And the representatives having 4-year term lines, Notre Dame took 200 years to build. Thorium's going to take a while to research. Trains take a while to build. So I would like to see venture funds and growth equity funds that say, we do not need another fucking Snapchat, right? We do not need more kind of like addictive technology, even though Metcalfe's law is awesome and we'll like make a lot of money doing it. Like, not only do we not need it, it's net bad for the world. So we're not going to fund that shit. We are only going to fund the things that the world really needs that are not currently on track to happen, that solve major problems. And we're going to do stuff not just in the domain of bits, because of course bits, I have no cost of goods in the domain of bits. So I can have exponential returns that I don't, because of all margin, that I don't have in the domain of atoms, where I actually have cost of goods. But the virtual is based upon the value of the physical. And so if the virtual starts to debase the physical because it's easier for capital to flow there, now, again, any system that emerges out of a foundational system and then debases its own substrate is self-terminating. The virtual needs to enrich the physical, not debase it. So a healthy social media would be one that made people's friendships and physical life better. But if I'm with my friends and I'm checking fucking Facebook, or I'm so socially awkward because I grew up on it that I don't have real friends, then the virtual is debasing the physical. That is net bad for the world. If financially the virtual debases investment in the physical, that is net bad for the world. So I want to see people who are investing in long-term R&D of real stuff that needs to happen, specifically in the domain of atoms and energy, and who have a longer-term, event horizon associated with that. And it's still market, right? I'm not talking about nonprofit. I'm still talking about being able to make returns. And so start to think about dynasties again in your family name and being able to, optimize for that, because otherwise the time horizons are too short. So I do think that waiting to see, because building shit is hard. And so VCs have this position of let other people build shit, see the stuff that looks like it could succeed, and then try to capture as much ownership of it as possible, the board seats, et cetera, to be able to create a artificial distorted bubble on its valuation to exit. That's just fucking evil, right? Like, it's bad for everybody other than them in terms of bad for the world. I would like to see people who have capital saying, how do we deploy this capital, which is concentrated choice-making ability, to actually make good choices, right? When we're talking about choice-making power needs choice-making basis, money is concentrated choice-making. So what are we doing it in service to? And for the most part, anyone who has asymmetric power is incented to and capable to use their asymmetric power to maintain and increase the asymmetry of their power. That will always, that's evil, right? That's the fucked up thing. We need to say, how do I use my asymmetric power to actually